As I said in the revision session yesterday, I said I'd do a series of overview videos of this document here that we went through. So I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to focus on the medieval period. I remember we talked about how religion dominated the medieval mind during this period. And it's essential we understand this context so we understand the nature of the prevailing attitudes and the nature of crime and how it was enforced. Remember, it was an agriculturally based society and people believed that God appointed the king and therefore everything in it. This belief in religion was so strong that many people didn't question it. This helped to reinforce the idea of the feudal system, and this provided that hierarchy. This was never questioned. So remember, we've got God at the top. He appointed the king because essentially the argument is that the God created world and everything in it. So we've got this context here, but essentially it's agriculturally based society. And then we've got the prevailing attitudes. And the prevailing attitudes during this area was predominantly that crime was the devil's work, and that it should be punished severely in order to deter people. We sum this up as ret and det. So we've got retribution, essentially getting revenge because of the crime that's being caused, and deterrence, ret and det. Deterrence being, let's make the punishment so bad or so humiliating that people will never actually commit the crime. Now, interestingly enough, the nature of crimes during this period, murder rates were very, very high. We know murder rates were high because of some of the documentation from the period. It's not entirely reliable, but nevertheless we have an indication. Now, even though we had traditional crimes during this period, such as rape and theft, etc., theft was linked to harvests. And the theft was linked to harvests because we know that when the crop was bad, there was less crops, so therefore the price of it went up. People couldn't afford those crops, so it led to the theft. So theft was linked to harvests. Just going back to this notion of murder rates being very high, remember how this was also linked to that notion of strip farming. Remember how peasants were allowed to work in a lord's field. They were given strips. One person would farm that strip there, and another person or another peasant would farm that strip, and so on. Lots of arguments happened because the farmers and the peasants would fall out of these bits in between. And we know that they had those weapons like hoes, etc. And those tools would be used in those arguments. People would fall out and people would get murdered. So murder rates were very high. Also, vagrancy, we've got the new type of crime for this period. Don't forget that was linked to the Black Death of 1348. And in 1348, about a third of the population was wiped out. That meant that workers could begin to demand higher wages because there weren't enough workers. So essentially they said, pay me this much or I will work for somebody else. Now, this upset the lords of the manor because they were having to pay out more in wages. The king stepped in and introduced a new law of vagrancy, which meant it was illegal to seek work from one village to another. And essentially this was all about prevailing what we refer to as the status quo. And the status quo revolved around this notion that the king needed the rich to stay rich, because in times of war, the king needed to be able to call on the lords of the manor in order to get the soldiers that the king would need. So this was about preserving the status quo. We also know that there were crimes around heresy, and heresy was about going against the teachings of God. In addition to that, we've got treason, and treason being going against the king. We've also got here the punishments at the time. And we know that the punishments, crimes over 12D would lead to hanging. That was the difference between a petty crime and a serious crime. That notion of anything over 12D was a serious crime, and that would lead to capital punishment. We know that fines went to the lord, to the church or the king, and prison was normally only associated with debt. Okay, so prison at this point was only for those people who were in debt, but there wasn't a sense of inequality at this period. that the rich had better prisons. The poor had to pay the jailer for the food. The rich had to pay for their prisons, but they would stay in more luxurious areas like castles. So there was a sense of inequality, and that's a massive difference from nowadays. We know that death was a punishment. That notion of the different types of death ranged from hanging to being burned alive and local methods. So, for instance, in Dover, they might be thrown off the White Cliffs of Dover even to kill them. And we also know that there was the most extreme punishment of death, which was being hung, drawn and quartered, and that was associated to the crime of treason. But essentially public humiliation ran across this. So some of the punishments from the early modern period that we've got here, even though they're on this side, the punishments of the pillory and the stocks and whipping, that was also the case for this medieval period. And then finally we've got enforcement. And enforcement revolves around this idea that it was about maintaining the king's peace. After all, the king was responsible for the peace. They refer to it as the king's peace. But everyone had to play their part, because after all, there was no paid police. We know about this notion of hue and cry. It was a village's responsibility for hue and cry. If they didn't, they were being fined. It was their responsibility to challenge a crime that was going on. And then we've also got tithings, this idea of men were organised into groups of 10, and if one person committed a crime, then it was the other 9 people's responsibility to take them to the court. Enforcement during this period also revolved around 3 types of courts. We've got the manor courts for local crimes, church courts for religious crimes, and royal courts at this period for serious crimes. And remember, we also know that there was a structure in place. Although it was primitive in comparison to today's standards, there was a structure. There were people like the sheriff that was in one county, the parish constable, etc., etc. So that essentially is the medieval period of this. In the next video, we're going to focus on the early modern work.